Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à cette deuxième journée de la conférence Epistemic Oppression and Decolonization. Today we'll start with the keynote by José Medina from Northwestern University, about 45 minutes of presentation and then half an hour for questions. So first.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking Amandine for putting this wonderful conference together, and also Veli and everybody who has been involved in organizing this wonderful event. So thank you so much. I know how much work it is, especially this big conference. I mean, 3 full days. Yesterday was incredible. So I feel like my presentation is like half baked. So it's still very much work in progress, and I hope that's okay. It does connect with at least some of the discussions we were having yesterday. I'll try to make that explicit, although I think it will be obvious at various points. Sorry for the really long title. The important part of the title is the beginning, the epistemic border crossing. That's what I'm going to focus on. And if I don't accomplish anything else, at least I hope I will accomplish describing what epistemic border crossing is. I'm trying to convince you that that's a thing. And it's a thing that is important to do. So it has to do, as you can imagine, with not respecting borders that have been created to police, right? Going back to Karen's talk yesterday, to police different epistemic activities, different ways of producing knowledge, understanding, communicating experiences, and how these borders create separations, create impossibilities, block the formation of certain communities so that they cannot communicate, they cannot engage in the kinds of epistemic practice they would like to engage. And what I'm going to suggest is that, well, the point is not so much to criticize the illegitimate way in which that border was created, the illegitimate way in which an epistemic norm is established and enforced. The point is rather just to transgress it. And through practice, to do things in such a way that you don't respect the border, right? You cross the border illegally, so to speak. I'm going to start with an analogy with literal illegal border crossings, right? At various geographical locations, especially the southern border of the US, but also the southern border of Europe, right? Blocking immigration from Africa, from the Middle East, and so on. So I'm going to start with an analogy there, but then I'm going to try to convince you that just like illegal border crossings have a subversive potential that we have to pay attention to, epistemic border crossing also have a subversive potential that we have to pay attention to. So that's going to be like the main thing. Let me just mention briefly before I start why I have that long subtitle. In a way, it's just calling attention to things that have to do with my own account of epistemic resistance and things that I think connect with the account of epistemic border crossing that I'm going to offer today. And I'm going to suggest that epistemic border crossing is crucial in order to mobilize a community of resistance that is heterogeneous, that has vibrant diversity, and is attuned to the diversity of voices and perspectives within. So unless you engage in this particular kind of epistemic border crossing that I'm going to describe in more detail, you're not going to have that kind of polyphonic community of resistance in which there are multiple voices. So it is for the sake of polyphonic resistance in which people resist in multiple voices without being unified through a single viewpoint that I'm giving this account. It's for the sake of making that possible. And I want to say also that that connects with what I call collective epistemic self-empowerment, right? And I want to make clear from the beginning that by self-empowerment, I don't mean going from having no power, being completely powerless, to becoming this powerful collective agent or whatever it is. That's not my model at all. In fact, it's almost the opposite, as you may know, if you know some of my work. I think that, and even under the worst conditions, even after conditions that appear to be like epistemic death, like your soul has been killed, your voice has been killed, you cannot speak, you cannot do anything. As some of you know, I claim that even under those conditions, people still have power. Their epistemic faculties, their epistemic capacities are still there. It's only that your epistemic power sometimes cannot be exercised. It gets blocked, right? However, I think, so there is always power. It's a matter of how we rearrange things, right? So that that power can be exercised. But also, sometimes we also have to rearrange things so that people's powers become connected, right? And they can work together. And they can do something at the level of a community that they couldn't do individually. So it is that kind of collective epistemic self-empowerment that I am trying to go after. So let me start with the analogy with physical, geographical border crossing, and in particular, illegal border crossing. Why should people south of the border of the US respect that border? Why should people, not only from Mexico, but from other Latin American countries who are displaced, who are trying to escape poverty, why should respect that border? And shouldn't the illegal border crossing be a way of saying, we don't respect this border. This border is illegitimate. And there are, as you probably know, not only in the US, but also in Europe, some migrant movements that have used particular slogans that are interesting and important. One such slogan is, we are here because you were or you are there. It's like, what do you mean we're not welcome here, we're not entitled to cross this border, or we should not be here, or we don't belong here, when you already occupied us and you are there and you're displacing us, right? And that's obviously a very important point to take into account. It leads to issues of entitlement. Not only the border may be illegitimate, arbitrary, but also people may be entitled to cross that border even when the legal institutions are saying that they're not. And then, of course, another important slogan is, we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? And that's true in very specific historical, geographical, particular ways for people, for example, at the southern border of the US, right? Their ancestors were there. They've been there for generations. They've been there with freedom of movement, right? That now is limited or blocked for particular reasons that are not clearly legitimate. Now, given all of that, some people, and one of them is Robin Selikates in a forthcoming essay and in other works that he's developing right now, have claimed that illegal border crossing is a decolonial praxis. You decolonize, right, those borders by crossing them illegally. And for example, Selikates says that those illegal border crossings unmask, and this is a quote, the extant international legal fiction and the logic of formally independent autonomous nation states. Those illegal border crossings resist the logic and ethics of colonial and neocolonial interconnection, and they vindicate third world migration to the first world as an entitlement of neocolonial imperial membership on grounds of political equality. So he gives an entire account that we can come back to, and there are other ways of justifying illegal border crossing as a legitimate practice and as a praxis of decolonization. As I said from the beginning, I'm not so interested in issues of justification, but I'm just interested in a praxis that does something important, that has a subversive potential, that can create opportunities for resistance. And now what I'm going to do is to try to connect the physical border crossing, literally physically moving from one side of the divide to the other, the geographical border crossing with the epistemic one. And in a way, what I want to say is, just like colonization created these frontiers, these borders between physical spaces to separate them in particular ways, colonization also created frontiers, borders in our exercises of the imagination, in the way we think, so that they separated out ways of thinking, ways of expressing yourself, ways of communicating, ways of narrating, and I'm going to focus specifically on storytelling, so that if you were to, engage in memory work, if you were going to remember certain events or experiences, you had to do it in a particular way. If you were going to express those memories, right, you'd have to do it in a particular way. And you had to respect those epistemic norms and those ways of policing those regions of the imagination that are not supposed to mix or connect. And that's what I'm going to say. Okay, that's there, right? The Western Academy and Western epistemological frameworks have created these different activities that are supposed to follow these different norms. And that does not allow for a lot of the things that people want to imagine, a lot of the things that people want to do to produce understanding and knowledge. And these colonized subjects are more than entitled. In fact, they have a vibrant practice of not respecting those borders, of not respecting those norms, right? And that creates the epistemic border crossing. Just like there is a geographical border crossing that has this subversive potential, there is an epistemic border crossing that has this subversive potential. I'm just going to mention, I don't use it for the rest of the talk, but it's there in the background, that there are, of course, decolonial thinkers who have addressed similar things, and they have been helpful for me. So in a way, I'm drawing from them, but I'm doing something different. And there are two in particular I want to mention. One is probably the most obvious one here, Walter Mignolo and his account of epistemic disobedience, right? You disobey epistemic norms that are constraining your thinking, and they are constraining your imagination, and they are constraining your epistemic practices. And that is, of course, related to what I'm saying in very important ways. There is also, in a more indirect way, but nonetheless important as well, Maria Lugones' account of complex communication and how sometimes there isn't even a single set of norms, a single set of norms of intelligibility, for example, that you're using in your practice, because there may be multiple norms, multiple standards of intelligibility, multiple activities that converge and are performed at the same time. And there's an entire account that Maria Lugones gives, as you know, saying that unless you engage in this kind of very difficult, complex communication, you are not going to be transformed. You're not going to open yourself up to other people's experiences and ways of thinking and ways of producing understanding and knowledge, and you're not going to be transformed by them, and they're not going to be transformed by you. And all of that is in the background as well. But the reason why I think I'm doing something different, and I'm going beyond that, is because I want to connect the crossing with actual practice of activism. How do activists on the grounds, on their own, do this kind of thing? So I don't want it to be just an academic exercise. I don't want to be connecting, the Western establishment of knowledge production with the Latin American or African or Asian establishment of producing knowledge. I really want to talk about grassroots practices and how they cross epistemic borders, right? How they violate epistemic norms, and how that is done in practices of activism. And that connects, obviously, with my most recent account of what I call epistemic activism, in my latest book, The Epistemology of Protest, and in a bunch of articles. And what I'm trying to develop here, and this is the part that is still in progress, is still work in progress, is that one important part of epistemic activism has to do with epistemic border crossing. And that epistemic border crossing is aimed at collective self-empowerment of the oppressed. And for this talk in particular, I'm just going to focus on one way of doing that, one thing, and that is in testimonios colectivos in Latin America. And as other authors do, like Patricia de Rocher, who I'm going to quote later, and others, I'm going to keep the Spanish phrase testimonios colectivos or testimonios, even though obviously it's very easy to translate. I could obviously say collective testimony. But the problem is that part of what we're trying to get at is that what is typically understood as testimony in the Anglo world is supposed to follow norms that our collective testimonios, right, in these activist practices are not following. So in order to mark and highlight that there is something distinctive here that is very different from our standard practice of testimony in the US or in European countries or in Canada or in other Western countries, I'm going to keep the Spanish phrase, right? And more specifically, I'm really talking about feminist Latin American testimonies that happen in very specific contexts. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of those. And testimonials obviously go beyond feminist movements in Latin America, but I'm going to be focusing on those. And more specifically, I'm going to focus on these two figures who are probably familiar to many of you, Rigoberta Menchú and Nora Strejilevic. So Rigoberta Menchú, as you know, is a Guatemalan Quiche activist. So for a long time, she was amazing and did incredible work struggling for indigenous rights. And in the early 80s, she published, and I'm going to tell you more about that, Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú. And then in 1992, she received the Nobel Peace Prize. And then in the late 90s, there was this huge scandal that I'm going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute, and you're probably familiar. If you are as old as I am, and only a few of you are, you're probably very familiar with this. The younger crowd, probably not so much. So I'm going to focus on that, the kind of testimonials that Rigoberta and many of her activist colleagues were doing, right? And how they were engaged in epistemic border crossing. But then also I'm going to say just a little bit also, I won't spend as much time, about the Argentinian feminist testimonies around forced disappearances and torture and imprisonment during the junta, during the dirty work, right, during the La Guerra Sucia. And Nora Strejilevic, when she was a child, her brother and other family members were kidnapped by the military, and she actually was put in a detention center in a concentration camp, really, for many, many years. And the reason why I chose her to supplement what I'm going to say about Rigoberta Menchú is because for her, it was very, very difficult to tell her own story. Yeah, it took her forever. And one of the ways in which she eventually was able to overcome that silence, and she was able to engage in storytelling, is through the creation of a community and through listening to other people's stories. Right? I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But even before I go to those two cases, let me actually announce from the beginning so that this is clear, or I hope it's fairly clear, what are the more specific epistemic borders that I'm going to be talking about? Because there are many, right? So these are just three that I have thought about enough so that I can present something coherent to you today. And there are three epistemic borders that have been created through colonial practices and that they need to be subverted, resisted, they need to be crossed. One is the divide between the individual and the collective. And this has a lot to do with what Abe, where are you, Abe? Over there. What Abe was telling us yesterday about the critique of epistemic individualism. And as Abe was saying yesterday, well, there is communalism, right, that actually rejects a lot of the assumptions of this Western individualism that creates this divide between the individual and the collective. And precisely the kinds of storytellings that I'm interested in are those that overcome the divide between individual voices and collective voices. Because we're going to be talking about the stories, right, that are not told in a single individual voice, but they are also not told in a single homogeneous collective voice either. So it's not the story of the people, but it's not my story, right? I'll get to that. But that is an important divide between the individual and the collective. You have to choose between speaking in the I or speaking in the we, right? You have to choose between telling an individual story, talking from your own subjective perspective, or talking from this collective perspective. Then also, the second border that I want to talk about is the border between the speaker and the listener, or in testimonial practices, the testifier and the observer, or the third party who gives uptake to the testifier. And as you know, I mean, this is going to be problematic in many ways, right? It creates the impression that the first person voice that is speaking is a subject, and you have subjectivity over there. But that has to be, you know, assessed and properly processed by the audience, by the listeners, who are objective or will give objectivity to the account that was told in the first person. So the second divide or frontier is created not only between the speaker and the listener, but between subjectivity and objectivity, right? And there too, there are all kinds of things that cannot be done for as long as you keep that divide in place, for as long as you respect that border. And then finally, the third border that I'm going to be talking about is the border between the factual and the fictional, right? And this connects with at least part of the discussion we were having with Eric yesterday, when he was talking about the facts and the important facts and the background facts. And I think many of us agree with him, but we said, yes, that's true, but the facts don't speak for themselves, and the facts also need to be embedded in a story or in a narrative framework of some sort. And we have to imagine how these facts hang together in a particular way. So it is precisely that kind of thing that I'm talking about here in number 3, right? And how our lived experience, right, what we have lived, connects with our powers to imagine how things have been, but also how things could have been, how things could be. So how to connect the factual and the fictional, how to connect the lived and the imagined. Not in the sense that we are going to, reject the facts or speak disregarding the facts or anything. But I'm is the factualism that creates this particular kind of boundary. Okay, what's the point of crossing these borders, crossing these boundaries? Well, I'm claiming, and I'll get to this in the conclusion, but at the very end, that when you cross the first border between the individual and the collective, the possibility of speaking in multiple voices appears. The possibility of polyphony appears, so that I speak in multiple voices, not just an individual isolated I, but there are multiple voices inside them, and they are in fact voices that connect with perspectives of the community, communal voices. A community also doesn't have to speak in a single voice. They can speak in multiple voices, okay? The point of crossing the second border is that you are able to create a bidirectionality between the speaker and listener. So can reverse roles, and speakers and listeners at the same time, right? So that there are ways of shared experiences and shared meanings in which we become creators of those meanings, in which people share their experiences and connect them in particular ways. And then this community that I'm talking about remains heterogeneous, right? It's a community of resistance that remains heterogeneous. And empowers speakers and listeners who are the same. I'll get to this. Hopefully, I will clarify with the examples. And then finally, rejecting the third divide, and by the third epistemic border, there is possibility of imagining and living in resistant ways. And this connects with my own account of the resistant imagination. And then all of these 3 things together create possibilities for collectives, epistemic self-empowerment. Okay, so let me start, and I'm taking more time than I thought. I thought I was going to be done in half an hour, but I guess not. Let me start, especially for those of you, actually, let me ask you, how many of you are completely familiar with Rigoberta Menchú? Oh, not many, okay. So most of you are not. So let me say, I won't spend too much time, but let me say just a little bit about this. The Spanish edition from the 1982 book that notice, and this is important also to notice, that the Spanish title is Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia. My name is Rigoberta Menchú, and this is how my consciousness was born. In English, is what translated as I, Rigoberta Menchú. Right, which is a huge problem because, as she says, right in the preface, in the interview with Elizabeth Burgos, as she says elsewhere as well, this is not about me. I'm not speaking in the first person singular. I'm not speaking as an I. And then it is translated in English, I, Rigoberta Menchú. Big problem to begin with, right? But even in the Spanish edition, there are two problems that you're probably noticing already, right? One problem is that after she won the Nobel Peace Prize and she received a lot of attention and so on, they added, right, this. Oh yeah. You're right. I'm pointing at myself. Okay, exactly. So they added this little thing, right, which was not at all connected with anything she said. In fact, as you will see in a minute, quite the opposite. They added, this is the autobiography of the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, that's going to be a problem as well. But then the other thing that was there from the beginning, even in the first edition, as you can tell, is that the author, or what appears to be the author, is the editor, Elizabeth Burgos. And Elizabeth Burgos is an anthropologist originally from Venezuela, but she's the wife of a well-established French philosopher. The more important point is that she's an academic. She's a well-respected academic, well-connected, not only in Argentina and other parts of Latin America, but in Europe, right? And she becomes, in a way, what Charles Mills calls the white authenticator of the non-white voice, right? And that is obviously a big problem that we can come back to. But more importantly, for what I'm going to say, let me go to the scandal at the so-called scandal at the end of the 1990s, right? That you may be familiar with as well. So the so-called expose. So here comes an American anthropologist, like more than a decade later after the publication of this work. His name is David Stoll, and David Stoll specializes in Guatemala and the Mayan culture. And he was like, oh my God, this woman has tricked all of us. This woman has tricked the Western world, and I'm going to show you. And he published that famous New York Times piece, Rigoberta Menchú and the Story of All Poor Guatemalans, right? In the expose, he said there are contradictions and tensions in facts that she tells. It is impossible for her to have been in all these places at the same time. She is including in her own narrative things that are not her own experience. She is connecting her life with all these other lives. So as the slide says, he was accusing her of constructing a composite narrative that wove together several people's lives events and integrated them with her own life story. Now, the interesting thing is that, as she tells you, what she was trying to do in that narrative was to create a composite narrative that wove together several people's life events and integrated them with her own life story. So she was accused of tricking people because she did what she was exactly trying to do. And then, of course, David Stoll is claiming, well, this is a bad autobiography. She's not doing autobiography in the right way. This is non-factual. She's an imposter, essentially. So she replied that the book, I, Rigoberta Menchú, which is the English translation, was not an autobiography, that it was a testimonial, un testimonio. And that the history of the community that she was telling is her history. And that she is herself the product of her community. And this has a lot to do with what Abe was telling us yesterday about the subject itself, the I, being constructed by the community and being something that you can only understand through the experience of the community and so on. And in a very important way, what she means by this is a testimonial, and what is meant by testimonial is something that you cannot understand as through the Western concept of autobiography, because it's something that involves both personal memory and collective memory at the same time. And if you don't do it at the same time, if you don't do it together, then you're not doing testimony. You may be doing something else, but you're not doing testimony. And that's the important point. And this is exactly what I want to highlight as one way of polyphonic narratives or polyphonic storytelling becoming possible, because you have multiple voices that echo each other and support each other. in particular ways. Not merging, not saying we're all the same, or not saying their experiences are my experiences, but it is about saying our experiences are connected in particular ways. And you're not going to understand my experience. In fact, I am not going to understand my own experience if I don't connect it with all these other experiences. And multiple voices start speaking at the same time. And there is this polyphonic storytelling that is happening. So this is already the first border crossing that I want to call attention to, the subversive crossing of the individual-collective border. And what happens when you do that? Many things can happen, but in particular, these three things are happening. You have an I that is at the same time a we, right? You have a we that is not homogeneous. It's not a single unified we. It's a we that is composed or contains multiple voices. You have testimonials, practices of narrating your experience and so on that involve this heterogeneous polyphonic collective storytelling. And you have the echoing and the interweaving of voices. Now, Patricia de Rocher, who I'm drawing from in important ways, says the following about this. While autobiography has traditionally been utilized to convey Western narratives of self-made man, testimonia is firmly rooted in liberation struggles in the global South. So there is a huge difference there already. I mean, these epistemic practices couldn't be more different. They have different origins, different trajectories, they're trying to accomplish very different things and so on. She goes on to say, Patricia says, by narrating her account, and she's talking about Menchu, in terms of collective memory, Menchu stakes a claim in how testimonial can be utilized to advance social struggle. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of this epistemic divide, David Stoll, enables Northern readers to sit comfortably in their first world bubbles, unaffected and blameless, claiming victim status for falling prey to the fictional ruse of this third world troublemaker. Let me now shift. We may come back, especially if I have time, to Rigoberta Menchú. Let me shift now to Nora Strejilevic. So Nora Strejilevic is publishing, for example, in this particular book, and there is an English translation, as you can see, a collection of interviews of survivors of political persecution, kidnapping, torture, and imprisonment in Argentina during the Dirty War. So this book contains interviews, stories. Some of them are fictional stories. It also contains some of her own stories, Nora's stories, along with those of many others she was working with. And she says, I needed to hear other stories coming from the same place in order to complete my own. All of these unfinished stories became a choir that opened the key to my own despair. So she claims that she could only start feeling certain things. She could only start understanding certain things. She could only start narrating her own story through hearing other stories, through connecting her own story with others. And then she goes on to say, this is de Rocher analyzing Strejilevic and speaking about this point. De Rocher says, while each individual story is unfinished on its own, when placed in resonance with each other, a multi-voice choir emerges that helps each individual narrative become a more complete story, a kaleidoscopic consciousness. So de Rocher is drawing from my work and saying, well, this is exactly what José Medina is talking about. This is the way we should understand kaleidoscopic consciousness, right? And this could be what, I mean, de Rocher doesn't say that, I'm adding that. And this could be what Rigoberta Menchú means when she says, I'm telling you how my consciousness emerged. Okay, so this is the emergence of a counter community of shared experiences and shared memories and shared meanings, right? The co-creation of this epistemic practice and this epistemic subversive practice that is crossing this border. And it involves the interbreeding of experiences, right, in testimonials. So as Strejilevic says, I needed to hear, I mean, I already got these quotes. I want to go to these other quotes. In testimonials, de Rocher says, individual narratives become meaningless without grappling with the overlap and departures between them. Their collage-like fragmented narratives allow room for the backward and forward processing of interpersonal memories involved in producing a historical account and model the possibility of a kaleidoscopic consciousness. And that has to do with the way in which we can understand a critical standpoint, right? As the second quote says, I'll just read the last part, a standpoint can only begin to materialize through sustained attempts to work through the contradictions and complexities that arise from the social differences present in interpretative communities, okay? And that's why keeping the heterogeneity alive and cultivating that polyphony becomes so important, because otherwise resistance could not happen in that very way. Okay, now let me say just a little bit about the second border that needs to be crossed, the subversive crossing of the speaker-listener border. And by the way, I'm not gonna spend much time on this, but I mean, as some of you are fully aware, I mean, obviously Gail Polhouse has written on this. There is something very problematic, at least in one part of the epistemic injustice literature, which is that it's all focused on the listener, the audience, right? And in a way, so the listener, the audience is supposed to be, you know, the people who could perpetrate epistemic injustice are the people who could correct it. They are assumed to be empowered in a particular way, whereas the speaker or the people who are vulnerable to epistemic injustice are supposed to be disempowered or treated as mere objects of study. And that already is problematic. That has a lot to do with this border that I'm talking about. And that has a lot to do with what Gail and other people have said in the literature, like, no. We have to shift the focus back to the speaker, but also the speaker is not necessarily speaking to you. He's not necessarily speaking to the Western, dominant audience. They may be speaking among themselves, the horizontal practices that you were talking about yesterday as well, right? So that's exactly, even though I'm not gonna put it in that way, that's exactly what I'm talking about. If you shift from these vertical practices to the horizontal ones, one of the things that you may be doing is crossing this border that has been created between the speaker and the listener. So you are troubling the divide between the subjectivity, the assumed subjectivity of the speaker or testifier, and the assumed objectivity of the audience, the listener or the observer. You are creating the possibility of something that is neither a subject, not an object, something that is not fully subjective and not fully objective, something that is intersubjective. A resistant intersubjectivity that is going to negotiate the subjective and the objective in particular ways, but it's going to be crossing that border in particular ways. What is going on here in crossing this border is that you are no longer trying to get uptake or recognition or corroboration from your audience, right? You are engaged in this horizontal practice in which a speaker and listener take turns, right? They listen to each other's stories. That's the point. The roles of a speaker and listener become reversible, bidirectional. And what you're trying to seek is not at all corroboration, recognition from outgroups, but rather, and this is connected at least with one of the points that Eric was telling us about yesterday, you're trying to share stories and to share memories and to share experiences so that a particular kind of co-witnessing becomes possible. And there are problems there too, obviously, but the co-witnessing I'm talking about becomes important for the creation of a counter community of shared experiences and shared meanings. Now, of course, not everybody's going to be able to be a member of that community necessarily. And this has to do also with some of the discussions we were talking about yesterday concerning separatism and other things that we can talk about later on. But that's totally consistent with what I'm talking about. I'm not saying everybody will be part of this resistant counter community. So there is a particular academic investment in maintaining and policing this border, the border between the speaker on the one hand and the listener and the observer on the other hand. For example, Paulino Bueno says the study of testimonio has been transformed into a game of mirrors in which North American academics who write, speak, and publish on the subject assume the position of spokespersons, determining which book is worthy of study and why, right? So you have this academic practice that is totally betraying what is going on the grounds and is creating this game of mirrors in which the assumption is that, well, you have to corroborate stories, you have to recognize the validity of them or whether or not they are imposters. Right. And that is a way of policing this divide between the speaker, the testifier, and the observer. And as Nan says, what is happening is that testimonials, right, are now used for the educational benefit of dominant groups or of dominant audiences. As she says, it's almost like there is the instrumentalization of these testimonials to create a pedagogy of the unoppressed, right? And then finally, the Rocher also talks about this point when she says scholarship on testimonial has become increasingly apolitical, right? So you're not supposed to be, the testifiers can be political and subjective. You are not supposed to be political at all as an audience member, as the proper listener. So scholarship and testimony has become increasingly apolitical and out of touch with the writing form's activist intentions. How might Menchu's text mean differently when read by indigenous activists struggling for land rights in the North American context versus being assigned a first-year seminar at Harvard? Okay, let me keep going. So 2 points about this border crossing that I want to highlight: the bidirectionality or reversibility of roles. The Rocher also talks about when she says, in feminist testimonials, the labors of writing, memory, and dream work are reframed to hold meaning for the practitioners, writers, tellers themselves, long before their words reach a reading audience. And also the fact that it is a problem to assume that there is something going on in the grounds, and then the theorist is going to come later and theorize about it, because the people on the grounds, including the activists themselves, including Rigoberta, including Nora, they are theorizing themselves. They are theorizing their practice. They provide a critical philosophy, a subversive philosophy, and that already is important because you shouldn't expect that there is first the level of subjective experience, and then there is the level of objective third-personal critique. There is a macro-social critique in this very effective, very personal experiential account. Okay. So testimonials involve activist interventions. Practitioners of contemporary feminist testimonials are more than writers. They are textual activists who employ writing as social tools. That's the way the Rocher puts it. She also talks about practitioners of testimonials as word warriors. And then Nora Strejci-Levick herself also talks in that way. And she says, bombarded by another's language and culture, we play out our resistance to the siege, fighting in vain against the artillery of reality with phrases, our only weapons, right? And here the importance of language comes out. So this connects with at least some of the points that Tempest was talking about, right? How it is important that you speak in your own language, and that your own language is not distorted or translated in any way. And the whole point about testimonials not being something that seek corroboration or recognition is, of course, connected with Kelly Oliver's critique of recognition dynamics and the economy of recognition. She says, recognition is the soft currency with which oppressed people are exchanged within the global economy. In this way, recognition, like capital, is essential to the economy of domination. So obviously, we have to get out of that. By contrast, co-witnessing involves something completely different. To begin with, it involves horizontal practices. It involves the creation of a shared, of a community, a counter community of shared experiences in which people epistemically empower each other. And this is the emergence of a resistant intersubjectivity. Let me just say very quickly, because I'm running out of time, something about the third border crossing that I plan to say something about. So I want to say that there is a problem in assuming that the factual and the fictional are always at odds with each other, and they always have to be kept separate. And this has a lot to do, and some of you know, with my own account of the imagination, my own way of thinking about the imagination. The imagination, for me, is not something that is exercised only in fiction, only when we depart from reality, only when we depart from lived experiences. To me, the imagination is something that is always entangled with our own experiences. You cannot even experience life or reality without imagining your own positionality, without imagining yourself, without imagining others. So imagination is part of lived experience at every level. Perception even. How you perceive the world, even if it is in very difficult ways. It's not that you're projecting, imagining things, but you can only do that through the imagination. Memory also, right, requires imagining yourself at a point in time, and imagining yourself in a particular temporal trajectory and so on. So living and imagining are entangled, remembering and dreaming are entangled. Memory work is the kind of work that is not simply automatic retrieval of things that you have stored in your brain. There is something more than that mechanical way of thinking about memory. It requires exercising the imagination in ways in which sometimes it's very hard to do, especially when it comes to memories of traumatic events. You have to do all kinds of things before you are even able to retrieve anything. And that has to do with mobilizing, activating a resistant imagination that you may not even be able to do by yourself. You may need other people to do it with you. And this has a lot to do with the work of counter memory. That requires this really hard work of the imagination that is both personal and collective at the same time. So the Rocher, for example, says testimonials intentionally blur the line between fiction and nonfiction, mixing and matching the imaginative with the documentary, right? And if I had had a different life this year, if I had had the time that I thought I was going to have, I would have given you a different talk that focused more on the work, the activist work of that collective in Jamaica, the Sistren Theater Collective. But I just didn't have time to read about them and to put all of this together. But as you may know, if you have heard about them, they are victims of sexual abuse, and they use theater to work together in this resistant counter memory. And they change names and they fictionalize their own experiences and so on. So it is a way of mixing, fiction and nonfiction, a way of fictionalizing experiences, also putting different experiences of different people together in the same play. And they do like really interesting work in street theater. And I think it's a great way of thinking about crossing this particular border between the factual and the fictional. That has to do with the efforts of the imagination to test the limits of memory, to work through what we have lived, but also what we have not been able to live because our lives were blocked at some point through trauma. Okay, and this connects with my point that imagination is not a luxury or a privilege, but a necessity, something that we need. And we need the resistant imagination, especially for a number of things, for carving out a space for new meanings, for new forms of intelligibility, for establishing a bridge or for connecting different walls, right? Walls in the plural, as we were talking about with Gail's talk yesterday. And connecting different standpoints and creating a heterogeneous resistant intersubjectivity. Okay, so I was going to say a little, given that I'm out and that if you cross this border, you get resistant polyphonic possibilities. If you cross the second border, you get a resistant community of experience and a meaning. And if you cross the third border, you get resistant imaginations and memories. And I'm hoping to have shown that all of this amounts to collective forms of epistemic self-empowerment. Thank you.